All right, so we've got a mini swatch here, and in this swatch I'm going to show you a few different ways to knit the bobbles. So I will first show you a few different increase methods, then I'll show you a few different ways to work back and forth across those new stitches, and then we'll take a look at some decrease options. So this first option here is using the yarn over. So if you're not familiar with the yarn over, you're going to take your working yarn, wrap it from the back to the front of your needle. Then you're going to knit into that stitch, but don't pull it off your left hand needle. Wrap it again, so a second yarn over, knit that stitch a second time, and then wrap it around again, and knit that stitch a third time. I'm going to work with 6 stitches here, so at this point, I can take that off of my left hand needle, and now I can work back and forth to form the body or shape of my bobble. So that's one method of creating a bobble stitch. It's a little bit loose and sometimes can be a little bit more difficult to work your bobble. So I prefer the knit front and back method. So in this I'm going to knit through the stitch, so knit through the front of the stitch, then take my right hand needle up and around to the back, and I'm going to knit through the back of the stitch. So that's my first 2 stitches. I'm going to repeat this 2 additional times, knit through the front, knit through the back, to create my 6 stitches. So knit through the front, knit through the back. Now, these stitches are a little bit more uniform, they're a little bit tighter, and it will be a little bit easier to work and create my bobble. So those are my 2 increase methods that I'm going to show in this video. Now we get into the part where you make the bobble itself. So we're going to work back and forth across these 6 stitches, even though we still have 3 more stitches to go on our row. We're going to work these short rows to create a bulk of knitting here, which will create the 3-dimensional bobble. So to do this, now that I've created my stitches, I'm going to turn my work around, even though again I'm not at the end of the row. The first way to work these rows back and forth is just simply to purl on the wrong side. So purl each of these stitches on this side, and then turn it around and knit across all 6 stitches. And you'll simply repeat this step for a purl row and then a knit row for as many times as your pattern calls. So that's the first method. Okay, so now we have our first bobble using the knit front and back, and then just working a few rows. Now you'll see if you kind of turn this to the side here, it creates a little bit of a hole. So I'm going to show you now a way to reduce that. All right, so we've got my 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we'll turn our work, and to help minimize and also round out the shape of our bobble, we're going to slip the first stitch of each row purl-wise. So that just simply means without knitting or purling this stitch, I'm just going to slip it from my left hand needle to my right hand needle. And then I will, for this wrong side row, purl the remaining stitches. 2, 3, 4, 5. So I've reached the end of my bobble. So I'm going to turn my work, and then to do this row again, I almost did it wrong. I'm going to slip again purl-wise. So even though this is a knit row, I'm still slipping it like I was going to purl it, okay? With my yarn and back though. And then I'll knit to the end of the bobble here. So this just starts to tighten up or round the edges of our bobble, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a sec. Okay, so I have my 2 bobbles on my tiny little swatch here, and I'm not sure how well you can see it, but slipping that first stitch in the different rows of the bobble tends to help round the edges. And if we look at it from the side here, you can see that there's more of a flap gap or hole here. And if we just start with a regular knit and purl stitch, than if we slip that first stitch purl-wise at the beginning of our rows. Now let's get into some tricks here on how to knit your bobbles without having to turn your work. So the first way to work a bobble without turning your project is to simply slip the stitches on to your left hand needle and then start knitting again. So this is almost like knitting an I-cord. When you do this, you'll want to pull your working yarn a little bit taut or tight so that it helps to give shape to the bobble. So that's one row. Again, try you a second time. You just slip these stitches, 3, 4, 5, 6, back onto the left hand needle, give a tug on your working yarn, and knit the row again. In this next method, you'll need 2 double pointed needles, and you can start to, if you're using a circular needle, you can pull that right hand needle through so you protect the stitches that are already transferred onto the right side of your knitting. So grab the working tail of your yarn and use whichever preferred method of creating the stitches. Again, I like knit front and back. If you're using multiple needles here, there's a little bit less risk of dropping a stitch in that transfer. So we've got our 6 stitches here. And then because this is a double pointed needle here, all I have to do is slide the stitches to the other side or the other point of this needle, and I'm ready to work that I-cord method again. Now, to be able to continuously just slide the stitches from one side to the other, you'll need to start knitting these stitches with a second double pointed needle. You'll just do this for the number of rows that you need to work your bobble. So for the next method that eliminates the need to turn your work, we're going to knit backwards or knit in reverse. You simply take the left hand needle, this is your working needle in this technique, from the left to right, front to back here, and then you're going to take your working yarn and wrap from the back of the needle to the front, and then knit the stitch. So from the left to the right, front to back, insert that needle, wrap your yarn around, and then grab the yarn and pull it through. You want to keep your tension nice and tight, and I would only recommend doing this in an actual project once you've had a chance to practice it a little bit, because your tension might be different from that of the rest of the project. So you simply do this for all of the stitches until you reach the end of your row, and then you would knit as normal. So for the decreases, I'm going to show you the method I use in most of my bobbles. That it's a 2-row decrease. So we're going to turn this over and purl 2 stitches together at a time. So we'll decrease the 6 stitches down to 3. And then on the knit side, we'll work a second decrease to get back down to 1. You can also do this if you're doing the reverse or backwards knitting technique. You would just go through the back of 2 stitches and knit the 2 of them together backwards or in reverse at a time. But since that's a little bit more difficult, we'll show you the purl 2 together. So I've turned my work around. I'm ready to purl 2, so I'm going to insert my right hand needle through 2 stitches at one time. We'll wrap the yarn around and just purl them as if we were working 1 stitch. So again, I'm going to take my right hand needle, work through 2 stitches at one time, wrap my yarn around and purl. Do that one more time. So I'm taking 6 stitches down to 3. And then we turn our work back around for this last row. And this is a double decrease that we have to work to go from 3 stitches to 1. So we slip the first purl-wise, knit these 2 stitches together, and then we take that slipped stitch, we're going to pick it up and bring it up and over. So that is the first, or a common decrease method for a bobble, and the reason this is so common is that it's pretty centered. Some of the other decrease options will make the bobble slant a little bit one direction or the other. After you work your decreases, you just continue knitting as called for by your pattern. Okay, so that was a 2-row decrease method. Now I'm going to show you 2 methods to decrease back to a single stitch that happen across just 1 row. If you've been working the I-cord method where you're slipping the stitches back onto the other needle, another simple method that's in that vein is to slip all 6 stitches back to your right hand needle. And then starting from the left hand side of the needle here, you'll identify this first left stitch on the left, then go right next to it and take each stitch up and over. So you're going to pick up 1 stitch at a time and pick each one up and draw it over that last stitch on the needle. So you'll bring 5 stitches individually up and over and then give it a nice tug. This bobble tends to lean towards one side, so that's why it's not, some patterns choose not to use this decrease method. But it's fairly easy. And doesn't look too dissimilar from the last 2-row decrease method that we did. The only difference is that you can kind of see those stitches compile at the top there. So I'll show you one more single row decrease method for your bobbles, and then you've mastered your bobbles. Okay, so this second single row decrease option is a little bit more complicated, where you're going to slip 1 purl-wise again, knit 2 together, bring that stitch up and over that we slipped, knit 2 together instead of slip 1, put that back on the needle, bring it up and over. Now we have 2 stitches. Just transfer them and knit them together as one. So that way you're kind of drawing all of your stitches towards the center point, and it gives you a nice rounded top to your bobble. So now getting into what to do once you've finished your row or round, you're going to continue following your knitting pattern instructions to knit back past this bobble. So I've worked this whole swatch in garter stitch. So I'm going to simply knit all my stitches in this row. But when I get to my bobble, I want to make sure that I'm knitting this stitch pretty tightly, and then the stitches on either side pretty tightly as well, to minimize the hole that the bobble can sometimes create in your knitting. So if you knit these pretty tightly, you're going to kind of shore up your knitting around that bobble, and it will look more integrated into the work. In some knitting patterns where you're knitting in stockinette stitch, this stitch in the row right after your bobble will sometimes call for knitting this as a twisted stitch. So to knit through the back of a purl stitch, you're going to identify that back leg and insert your needle almost the opposite way you would for a regular purl stitch, from back to front, and then purl it as normal. And then you would simply follow the instructions for the rest of the pattern. In this case, I'm doing a knit 3 for this tiny, epically tiny little swatch.